the U-2 spy plane crash, crisis, story. It's a really cool bit of Cold War history. Arguably, it's one of the kind of tipping points. It's really, really very, very important in terms of its consequences. The causes, not so much. The story behind it is really cool, but that's not the juicy bit. The juicy bit is the results of this crisis, of this plane crash. All right, so that's what I'm going to do today. Reasons behind or background to it, what actually happened, and then finally the consequences for Cold War superpower relations. All right, so set the scene a little bit. 1950s Cold War. It's a time of increasing tension. As you know, there was an arms race going on, both sides building up more and more and more nuclear weapons. You got this massive arsenal capable of destroying the world. Berlin was a flashpoint, a part of Europe where the Cold War kind of met head on, and there was a lot of problems there. And then Cuba in 1959 had been taken over by a man called Fidel Castro, who'd overthrown this pro-American guy, Batista, and America was a little bit worried about it because he seemed to be a little bit communist, and they were a bit concerned because he was only 90 miles from their back garden. So these three issues, arms race, Berlin and Cuba, were a bit of a concern. So the powers decided to get together, I think it was about 30 countries, to have a summit meeting. And they were going to go in Paris, and it's called the Paris Summit of 1960. Now, they were going to talk about arms controls to sort of stop this proliferation of nuclear weaponry, and what to do with Berlin and Berlin's status, whether it should be a free city, totally impartial, totally out of the Cold War, or what should happen. All right, so that's the reason. This Paris summit was going to be this real big deal. It was going to sort out a lot of problems, and that was set for mid-May. Problem was, on the 1st of May, 1960, the USSR shot down an American spy plane, a U-2 spy plane. It was shot down over Russia. Now, these spy planes could fly at 17 miles high. That's 70,000 feet, I think. Anyway, really, really very, very, very high in the sky. And they had amazing photographic equipment on them, like top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art stuff. I think the CIA boasted that they could read the headlines on a Russian newspaper using these cameras. And they flew over Russia, and they'd been flying over since 1956. And the Russians knew about it because they had their sort of radar pinging out, and they could see these aircraft coming over, but they didn't have a plane that could fly high enough to shoot it down. They didn't have missiles that could shoot it down. They said to watch, and the Americans flew over and took photographs of all the Russian missile bases and military camps and bases and strategically important places. Now, thing is, in 1960, the Russians invented a Zenith surface-to-air missile, which was capable of shooting down this U-2 spy plane. The Americans didn't realise this. Anyway, so on the 1st of May, the Americans flew over on a regular kind of spying mission, reconnaissance mission. It was a U-2 spy plane piloted by a man called Gary Powers. He was 30 years old, and the Russians shot a missile at him, and it exploded very close to him, and it pushed his aircraft down a bit lower. And then the Russians shot another missile at it, and that hit the aircraft, and Gary Powers ejected, floated down in his parachute, and when he landed, he was captured by waiting Soviet troops. Okay, so that's what happened on the 1st of May. Now, the Russians said, "Oh, you know, we've shot this plane down. Americans are spying on us," and the Americans can't admit to spying. So they had a plan, and the idea was that each pilot of a U-2 plane had a little needle of poison, and he was supposed to take, or he was supposed to take that in case of capture, so that he couldn't give away any secrets. And the plane was set to self-destruct. So the Americans figured, well, that's happened. They haven't captured the pilot. He's dead. The plane's destroyed. We can probably get away with this one. So they said, oh no, it was a weather plane getting weather data, and it veered off course, and it's been shot down. It wasn't spying. And the Russians went, oh, okay. And then Khrushchev basically came out and went, look, here's a photo. This is a photo of your plane, and it's obviously a spy plane. And here's your pilot, Gary Powers, a photograph of Gary Powers. They captured him alive. Now, they demanded an apology from the Americans, from Eisenhower. So you've got to say sorry, and you've got to stop all these flights over Russian airspace. Can't happen anymore. So Eisenhower went, yeah, okay, it was a spy plane. And he said, you know, we're going to cancel flights, but he refused to apologize for it. That really wound Khrushchev up, and Khrushchev said, well, you're going to have to apologize before we have any more talks. So at the Paris summit, when all this was kicking off, Khrushchev refused to even talk about arms controls or Berlin until Eisenhower had apologized. Eisenhower refused. Khrushchev walked out. Okay, and the summit collapsed. So that's the background to it, and the shooting down of Gary Powers, and the fact that America refused to apologize for these spying missions, or Eisenhower refused to apologize. So the result is very simple. There are three main ones, really. Firstly, obviously, the summit collapsed. So the Cold War continued, or it escalated. Love that word. It shows how the Cold War got worse and worse. Tension increased because of this incident. There was no test ban treaty, which was supposed to have been agreed, and that wasn't agreed until after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was no discussion on Berlin. And as a result, a year later, in 1961, the Berlin Wall was built to stop all the brain drain from East Germany into West Germany, into West Berlin. So the summit collapsed. Secondly, it was incredibly embarrassing to Eisenhower, and to the USA. They hadn't come out of this looking particularly strong, and Eisenhower actually he was, in the next election, JFK replaced Eisenhower, became the new president. And JFK promised to be really strong on communism, and that's what the American people wanted. And the third thing is that Khrushchev and the USSR became very, very confident. This was a big victory for them. They got one over on America. They'd come out of this looking very strong. They hadn't given in. America looked weak. So they grew in confidence. That has a few implications for some of the later events. The Berlin Wall, they felt they could get away with it, particularly with this young Kennedy in charge. The missiles in Cuba, they felt they could get away with. Obviously, that didn't work out quite so well. But the U-2 spy plane escalates the Cold War, made Russia feel very confident and able to push its relations with America. All right. As a separate point, probably not going to come up in your exam, but kind of nice to know, Gary Powers floated down. He was captured. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison in Russia. And in 1962, he was actually swapped for a Russian spy, Abel, what was his name? I wrote it down for you. He was swapped for a Russian spy, and he was the first. That was the first ever spy swap done in the Cold War. And he returned to the USA. He retired from the CIA, who had flown all these missions, and became a helicopter pilot for a TV station, and died in a plane crash in 1977. All right, a helicopter crash, 1977. So, causes, big problems in the Cold War. There was going to be a meeting to sort it all out. Unfortunately, just before the meeting, spy plane was shot down, and that destroyed the Paris Peace Summit, which led to an escalation of the Cold War. All right, cool, bye.